Hello, welcome to Jambark. I'm so happy you're here. I'm Akoswa Joy, the founder of What's Your Story Author Services, and this is the third year we're bringing you Jambark. And what it is 10 days of support for writers of all backgrounds, and for both of all backgrounds as well as of all genres. Whether you're a first-time writer, whether you're just at the idea stage and you don't even feel comfortable calling yourself a writer yet, whether you've got 10 books out there, this is still for you. Whether you write memoir, children's books, self-help, uh, um, poetry, today is designed to give you real momentum so that you can carry forward in 2026 and achieve the goals you're setting about now. What makes this event especially meaningful is that many of the voices you're hearing throughout Jambarks are writers whose books have been supported inside our community. People who were once uncertain, like you might be, uncertain but determined, now have real stories out in the world. This summit is a celebration of all that, too. I'd like to thank our sponsors. Jeanette Sherman and Carol Humphreys are sponsors who are also writers of this community. Jeanette presented last year but couldn't be here this time, and she has a series of children's books which celebrate childhood milestones like sleeping alone, brushing your teeth, first day of school, and her books are all in vivid color and are beautifully rhyming. She has a booth set up here, so you can go check out Jeanette and her material there. Plus, they will be in our Jambark book booth. The book booth, we've had a few hiccups, but expect to see it running this evening. And our second sponsor, Carol Humphreys, she's a representative of a company. It's a new shopping experience called 10X Direct, and it's a platform that champions Canadian products and will have a space for Canadian authors as well. It's a platform where it gives you money back the more you use it, as more as well as you get money back when you invite others to use it as well. So today, day two of Jambark, we're focusing on writing the hard stories. Let me get my slides set up for you. Oh, they've disappeared. Oh, here they are. So today, we're talking about writing the hard stories of courage, resilience, and healing. And this space. These stories they're real stories, and often the details of them can be quite emotional. Here we're not really going to be getting into the depths of it, but certainly we do when we're creating them. The main thing is that whatever stage you're at, you belong here, and your story matters, and it deserves to be held with care. So, what are hard stories? These are the ones that they're real life turning points. They can be stories of grief, illness and caregiving, addiction and recovering, migration, identity, oppression. For doing all this are often helps people when they're called to leadership. A hard story is like how someone became an authority, and often it's through going through some of these real stories, these real hard points, these turning points in life. Hard stories are those stories of betrayal, survival, and rebuilding, becoming new after life changes. These tend to be stories that come to me from for people who want to write memoir, self help, but also people use all of this in their fiction as well. Um, and what I wanted to remind you is that it doesn't need to be graphic to be powerful, because part of writing a hard story is knowing what to keep for yourself. In the first version, I'm going to talk a bit that you write for yourself, and in fact, on one of the Jambark days, we're talking about writing as healing. So writing as a way of getting things, the unspoken, out from in here, out onto the page, out of your head. So certainly parting of writing hard stories often includes that, but that doesn't mean that that's what you publish. But it's certainly part of writing a hard story. And the impact of these hard stories is immense. That's why people do it, because they most people who write have been helped by a book. So if there's a book that has helped you, one that you might consider a hard story, put the title in the chat. I know that I've been helped by so-called hard stories, whether fiction or nonfiction, including one fiction writer that I love who tells stories like this, but in a light way, is Ann Tyler. She's my favorite fiction author, and her books are always set in Baltimore. And one of my favorites is one that's called Breathing Lessons, and it's about this couple who's been married forever. They have a grown child, a son, who's got a child who he's not there, ashamed pretty much of how he's kind of impacted the relationship between the mother of his child and his son, and that marriage is breaking down. So over this weekend, they're looking at they're individually kind of looking at what they should do within their own marriage. Beautiful story, and how it resolves is equally beautiful. So that impact, the impact of that story on me was just feeling heard. Like you said, oh my gosh, that's my story. And that's what writing your story does. It gives language to the unspoken, to things that people are perhaps ashamed of about or couldn't or can't really get the words around. So by you writing your story, it helps other people to consider theirs. It reduces shame and isolation because people think, wow, that's me too. It creates belonging and connection. And so important in this, because that's humans need that. That's the worst thing about us having a hard story, is often you feel like you're the only one. And because you share yours, it builds courage in your readers. It turns your pain into purpose. In some cases, what I mean by that is that a lot of people, when they tell their stories, they feel so relieved that it could become a movement. And I've worked with people who created a movement out of their pain. And so the impact of these type of stories is both in a lot of people love reading stories, but also that they change lives. They change lives for all of those reasons. And the lives they change include your own. So how do people write hard stories? That's because they are hard. So that's part of the challenge of writing them, because often people who've had a so-called interesting life and who have lived through hard times have been told by many people, you ought to write a book. But then it's like, it's so immense. It's like, how do I start? Because for many of us, we know the details of our hard story, like what happened, and that's part one. And so when someone comes to me who wants to write a hard story, we often start with a timeline. And so that you can kind of have a list on, if you think of it like a spreadsheet, just say row one might be birth or something, because, some event. And so then you give that event a title, you describe what it is just factually, and then you talk about what it felt like, that second bit. So, for example, in my timeline, and the timeline is used often in therapy as well. And it is the act of just getting the events out in a factual way, which you'll later use in your story. And it's almost like your background research on yourself. So you're going to write down what happened. We talk about what happened, and that gets captured in a transcript. So you've already, in some ways, got some kind of a rough draft by having it recorded and speaking it through with someone. Then one of the main tools we use is something as simple as that timeline, where you're going to go back to it always, so often. And that's where you record what happened. But what happened isn't your book. In memoir, what it is a transformation. So it isn't just that this happened and this happened and this happened. It's like what that made you, what that felt like, but more importantly, the meaning, the what you know now from having experienced it. And I found so often that in writing these hard stories, that sometimes that's when you see the lessons, that's when you identify the patterns. And that's also so often where the forgiveness happens, where, for example, someone writing about their family and their dysfunctional childhood or something like that, they see these patterns and they see their parents perhaps as people who had hard stories and hard lives themselves, and in recounting that in through the timelines and through writing their own stories, that's where they gain the forgiveness and the meaning becomes more apparent then. And what's also then becomes hard in writing hard stories is by the time many people are writing them, they are past the time when they were in that pain, but they have to recreate it so that the people reading it experience it. And so it's almost like they're recreating it as if they're going through it freshly themselves. So here we're describing the three methods of understanding, but that doesn't create a book. A book then has to be created in the way you tell a story. And often for memoir and in most fiction, you want to start as close to the ending of that action as possible. In a way, you want to start in it. There is a genre which some celebrities, if someone's very famous, Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, those, that level of influence and fame, autobiographies are welcome from them, where they can start. I was born a coal miner's daughter. That's a fun line anyway, but you generally aren't going to start, I was born on May 3rd, whatever year. You're going to start in the action, and your book is going to be about what you know now, not necessarily about this is what happened. That's the difference between a historical account and the type of books that people want to write, where they're going to get people to experience these impacts. That's from turning what happened into a story that that shows your transformation and allows you to transform the audience in one way or another. Sometimes the transfer, when you're writing a book to educate, to educate or entertain. So that's the mixture: education and entertainment. Educate. So, the purpose of your story can be very different. And so having done this and have the levels of understanding, then you can kind of think about who your audience is, what you want them to experience from reading your book. And then that helps you decide how you're going to write it. You can have, like, for example, you can have a story of a transformation that makes people laugh through it, even though it's horrible, really, and that and what it felt like was absolutely horrible, but still, because and you can teach people about the meaning and share what you know in so many different ways, and that's part of figuring out how to write those stories. But definitely they always start with levels of understanding what your story is. So oh, let me give you a few examples before I introduce the speakers of today. So, for example, one of the stories, one of the speakers who cannot make it. Do I have his book right near me? It's far away, probably. Oh, it's in the other room. But he is a Canada well-known chef, and his story is one of addiction and recovery, and how he he became a great chef because, for one thing, in when he was in active addiction, he was really good with his hands. The one thing that his form of integrity was always that he was, as he describes, a bull worker, and he never missed a shift. The chef never missed a shift, at whatever job he was in, and he learned he had a gift, and with this gift he traveled the world, and also he gave people so much community and connection and joy from the way he could produce food. And that book is a beautiful story of the hard truth of of so many people thinking he was never going to live past 39. I mean, they thought he'd never make it to 30. And now he's well into his 60s and retired. Right now, he's spending 3 months in Mexico. And who would have thought that based on his story? And it became like in many stories of addiction, like these, because at first it was like, oh, you should write your story because all these things happened. But in writing your story, it becomes what you learned from that, as well as a gift. And his gift is this ability to transform all these like little ingredients around the world and bring them together. Um, one of the funniest stories he told me is about his curiosity, especially when he was becoming a master chef, and all of a sudden people were eating sea urchins, and he'd never even seen one before. So he got someone to bring him one, and so his whole thing was about it's the sensory thing of taste. So he poked his finger in and he scooped something out and he ate it, and he went, ugh. Turned out he poked his finger in the wrong end. And so what he was tasting. He wasn't experiencing it in the way that that's how he lived, that raw, and so there's so much richness in that, turning that event into what it felt like, and then what and how the gift he gave, which was through that. My very first book I did as a book coach was actually called Simply Women, and it was 30 stories. I think it was called 30 Magnificent Stories of Women Who Rose to the Top, or something like this. And these were all stories of courage, resilience, and healing. And that was because each one of the women actually was a life coach. And the woman who decided to compile these stories ran an academy where she trained life coaches. So she had so many women who applied then to become part of this compilation. And in each of them, they had lots of events that happened, so many reasons why people said, you ought to write a book. And so, of course, you'd record that in some way. You get to know, you then add that other layer of what that event felt like to them, and then the meaning. And again, it's not like for you can enforce the boundaries around it. The first, as I say, the first time you're writing this, it's for you, and so you tell it as it is. But as you shape it for your audience, you're then going to make these decisions based on how to reach them the best way, as well as how much you're willing to share and how you want to tell the story. Whether, like in that book, we have someone who comically writes of having a life like Shameless, like that show Shameless, and how one of her moments of change was when she met that Anthony Hopkins, the guy from Silence of the Lambs. She happened to, he was like sitting at a cafe on her own, and and so she wrote this humorous story, but you sensed her, but her, you sensed it, you saw that she transformed from one to the other, and but her story was written with real humor versus other stories where there's a different tone around them, but all of them go have this go through this you know um, layer of understanding within the author, and then kind of then at the secondary, you're looking at how you're going to transform what what I mean to say is that through this you get your transformation, and then as you're writing it, you figure out how you want to transform the author. Sorry, the reader. And so that's the beauty, and how you can gently start to write your hard stories. So if you're right at that beginning with the idea, someone's been telling you you ought to write your story, and it is one that perhaps falls in one of these categories, your first thing is to start recording in one way or other what happened. That's your first. So that's your homework. If you're wondering where to start with a timeline, and from that you can add the other layers. So today now I'm going to introduce what's happening on this day, where our next speaker is going to be Malia, and she's going to be talking about the power of acting with love and integrity. Oh, I haven't used my notes. Let me see if there's anything that I didn't say that I wanted to before I go into this. Oh yes, I did want to mention how to connect it to yesterday, because in yesterday's speaker, Shalene, she talked about trauma-informed interviewing and what it really means to ask questions with dignity. And so you might want to review that. The replays are available. And we also heard from Wilhelmina, who reminded us that story doesn't always live in a traditional book form. She's built her story. She's an activist, and she's a First Nation activist, and she talked about how she had a vision. She was from BC, and at that time she was living in Calgary, and she had a vision that she was to go to Red Valley. She had no idea where Red Valley was. Turns out that her husband was from Hamilton, and eventually, and actually they moved to Hamilton without her knowing the Red Valley was there. And she became a leader in that protest. And so her story, she decided to tell it not in the format of a book, but right now it's a website, because as a museum, where she has in her museum artifacts of her history of protesting, artifacts about what the Red Valley was, so that people can see what it was. As you know, her protest was successful in some ways, of course, because it would impact how much of they left of the Red Valley. But also her protest meant that there are artifacts and and there were there's artifacts and stories left of how people fought and even learned the value of the area. Because when she first went to Hamilton, as she told us yesterday, someone said, "You mean that place full of all that garbage?" But her story is one of a vision leading her to become a leader, and what that took of her. And she's created a story that's not a book right now, but it's a living museum rooted in place, memory, and purpose. And I love that because it reminds us there's so many ways to the truth. And the point is not necessarily the format, the point is meaning and impact. So now here is lovely Malia, and she's going to talk to us next. We're going to have a break and we're going to go back to the table. And then I'm going to bring up Malia, and she's going to talk about how we can stay ourselves despite all the crazy around us, or the difficult circumstances. The as Malia will describe, we know how fractious it feels the world is right now. And so Malia is a politician, a heart-centered politician, who will describe how you can still we can transform through this, because this soon will pass, and we can still be true to ourselves and stay in love, integrity, and honesty. And quite likely it'll pass in a much better form if many people get that message. And after Malia, we'll have Andrew, and he is an accountant who became a poet after his wife suffered a catastrophic stroke. And in the year of taking care of her, he transformed. He became so much more attuned with his feelings. And not only did he write an incredible book, Rebuilding Janice, he's written 4 anthologies of poetry so far. And so he's going to talk about poetry as devotion, and talk about love, memory, and caregiving. So now what Air Meet's going to do is I'm going to end this talk, and we're going to move back to the tables. And so if you will come to a table, what I would love for you to do is share one takeaway or one sentence that stayed with you in this discussion about writing hard stories. And if you prefer to just listen, hey, come to the tables and do that. But we're going to have about 5 minutes, and then we're going to bring Malia on. Thank you so much for being here. And I did forget that to mention that after Andrew's talk, we'll have some time, like an open mic, for anyone who wants to share their story or talk about what they are writing or what they'd like to. So see you at the tables. Thank you.